The alarm inside the training dome screamed before anyone could even understand what was happening. Red light poured across the walls, and every cadet in the room froze except me, because I was the one who had triggered it. My name is Kalen Dross, and I have spent 11 cycles teaching young officers about the deadliest ecosystems in the known galaxy. That morning, I was running a live simulation of a creature we call a ridgeback stalker, a six-legged predator from a world so hostile that entire survey teams had vanished trying to study it. The hologram towered 3 meters tall, its jaws wide enough to swallow a grown Velen whole, and it was charging directly at a cadet who had frozen in place. I shouted the shutdown command. Nothing happened. The projection kept moving, kept roaring, kept closing the distance, and for one terrible second, I thought the safety protocols had failed for real, not just in the simulation. Cadets scattered toward the exits. Someone knocked over an equipment rack. The noise was chaos, pure and undignified, exactly the kind of moment I use every single year to teach my students one lesson above all others. Fear keeps you alive. I finally reached the override panel and slammed my palm against it. The stalker froze mid-stride, then dissolved into harmless light. The room went quiet except for the sound of 20 young beings breathing hard, hearts pounding, faces pale in 6 different colors depending on their species. I let the silence sit there for a moment before I spoke. That, I told them, is what a Deathworld predator does to a mind that is not prepared. It does not care about your rank or your training record. It does not care that you volunteered for this class because you wanted an easy elective. It simply exists, and existing near it is enough to end you. I am not a human. I want to make that clear from the very beginning, because everything that happened over the following weeks changed the way I saw an entire species, and it started with a single misunderstanding on my part that I did not even realize I was making. I teach at Halden Academy, a training institution that accepts cadets from a dozen worlds who wish to serve in exploration, defense, or diplomatic corps. My subject is called threat ecology, though most cadets simply call it the fear class, and they are not wrong to call it that. The purpose of my course is simple. I show cadets the deadliest known biospheres in charted space, and I teach them to recognize danger before danger recognizes them. There is a category of world we do not visit in person for training. We call these death worlds, planets where the base conditions of survival are so extreme that most species who evolve there either perish early in their history or become something almost unrecognizable through relentless adaptation. Predators on death worlds are not simply strong. They are efficient in a way that feels almost cruel, shaped by uncountable generations of competition where losing meant disappearing entirely. Among all known death worlds, one name comes up more than any other in Academy records, and that name is Earth. I built an entire unit of my course around it. I have never traveled there myself, and very few instructors have, because the official recommendation from the Exploration Council is caution bordering on avoidance. Everything I taught came from historical survey logs, biological databases, and secondhand reports from the rare diplomatic missions that returned intact. I described saltwater predators capable of crushing bone with a single motion. I described insects small enough to enter a body unnoticed, while carrying diseases that could end a life within days. I described storms that could flatten a settlement, oceans that could swallow ships, and temperatures that could kill an unprepared traveler in either direction, freezing or burning, within hours. My favorite example, the one I used to close nearly every lecture, involved a creature from Earth's rivers with a bite force so extreme that our engineering department once tried to replicate it for a mining tool and gave up after their models kept failing under the pressure requirements. I would show a projection of this creature to my class, watch their reactions, and then say the sentence that had become something of a personal signature for me over the years. Deathworlders do not conquer their nature. They simply have not been erased by it yet. It was a good line. It made cadets sit up straighter. It made them respect the material. And for years it worked exactly as intended, because none of my students had ever met anyone from a true death world in person. That changed on the morning a transfer cadet walked into my classroom 15 minutes after the session had already started. She did not rush. She did not look apologetic. She simply opened the door, scanned the room once, found an open seat near the back, and sat down as if she had been there the entire time. I remember pausing mid-sentence, watching her settle in, waiting for some sign of nervousness that never came. Her file, which I pulled up later that day, listed her as Elena Marsh, transferred from a preparatory program on a colony world, average scores in most subjects, exceptional scores in survival tactics and field biology. Nothing in the file explained why she looked so unaffected by a hologram of a predator that had just made an entire room of trained cadets scramble for the exits only 10 minutes earlier. I decided to test her. For the remainder of that session, I ran a smaller demonstration, a projection of what our records classified as a mid-tier Earth predator, a massive furred creature standing upright on its hind legs, claws extended, a low growl building somewhere deep in its chest. Most cadets in the room actually stepped backward, even though they intellectually understood it was only light and sound. That reaction is normal. It is, in fact, the entire point of the exercise. Fear is instinctive, and instinct does not care whether a threat is real or projected. Elena did not step back. She tilted her head slightly, studying the projection with an expression that looked less like fear and more like mild curiosity, the way someone might look at a familiar shape in unfamiliar lighting. I noticed it immediately, because in 11 cycles of teaching, I had never seen a first-time viewer respond that way. I paused the simulation and addressed her directly, partly out of professional interest and partly, I admit now, out of a desire to see her flinch in front of her classmates. "Cadet Marsh," I said, "does this creature not concern you?" She considered the question for a moment before answering, and her voice was calm, almost conversational, the kind of tone someone uses when correcting a small factual error rather than making a bold claim. "It is a bear," she said. "Its ears are forward, and its weight is still balanced back on its heels. If it wanted to charge, its shoulders would already be dropped, and its ears would be flat against its head. Right now it is just curious about the noise from the room." The class went silent in a way I had never experienced before during that particular lecture. A few cadets exchanged glances. One of the Villan students actually leaned forward slightly, waiting to see how I would respond. I asked her how she could possibly know something so specific about a creature that had, according to every record in our database, killed trained survey teams equipped with modern protective gear. She shrugged, an oddly human gesture I had seen described in behavioral notes but never witnessed in person. "Bears are page 1, she said. "You have not even reached the parts of the file that actually worry us." I want to be honest about how that sentence affected me, because it did something no lecture, no research paper, and no survey report had ever managed to do in 11 cycles of teaching this course. It made me doubt the foundation of everything I had built my curriculum on. I did not respond to her immediately. I finished the session, dismissed the class, and sat alone in the darkened dome for a long while after everyone had left, staring at the frozen image of the bear still hovering faintly in the projection field before I finally shut it down. I had always taught my students that fear was the correct and rational response to a Deathworld environment. I still believe that fear serves an important purpose, but something about the way Elena Marsh looked at that projection suggested a different possibility, one I had never seriously considered before that morning. What if the beings who survive on Deathworlds are not simply the ones who fear correctly? What if they are the ones who eventually stop needing to? That thought followed me out of the classroom and into the long corridor that led toward the instructor offices, past windows that looked out over the training fields where other cadets ran obstacle courses under the pale afternoon light of our home system. I did not know it yet, but that single quiet sentence from a transfer cadet was about to unravel 11 cycles of teaching, one lecture at a time, and force me to rebuild an entire course around a truth I had never once considered. Humans were not surviving their world by being lucky. They were surviving it by understanding it better than we had ever bothered to try. I did not sleep well that night. I kept replaying her voice in my head, calm and unbothered, describing a supposedly lethal predator the way most beings describe weather patterns. By the time morning came, I had already decided what I needed to do next, even though I suspected I would not like where it led me. I needed to hear the rest of what she knew. The next morning, I arrived at the training dome early, before any cadets had gathered, and set up something I had never once attempted in 11 cycles of teaching. I pulled the restricted archive files on advanced Deathworld predators, the ones normally reserved for senior tactical courses, and loaded them into the projection system without telling anyone why. When the cadets filed in, Elena took the same seat near the back, unaware that today's lesson had been built entirely around her. I did not begin with a lecture. Instead, I called her name and asked her to come forward. The room shifted with quiet tension. Cadets glanced at each other, some clearly wondering if she was in trouble, others simply curious about what was about to happen. Elena walked to the front without hesitation, hands loose at her sides, expression unreadable in the way that I was quickly learning was normal for her rather than a sign of nerves. I told the class that yesterday, one of their peers had made a claim that directly contradicted years of established survey data. Rather than dismiss it, I said, we were going to test it properly. I activated the restricted archive and pulled up a full profile, one most cadets in that room had never been cleared to view. The projection showed a massive reptile from Earth's waterways, jaws wide, body submerged except for 2 eyes and a ridge of rough skin breaking the surface of dark water. I read the official statistics aloud. Bite force strong enough to fracture reinforced field armor. Ambush speed capable of closing several meters before a target could react. A survival strategy so effective that the species had remained almost unchanged for an extraordinary length of time, long before humans had even developed complex tools. I turned to Elena and asked her the same question I had asked the day before. Does this creature concern you? She studied the projection for a long moment, and this time her expression was more thoughtful than casual, as if she were choosing her words carefully rather than dismissing the question outright. It should concern anyone who does not understand it, she said. But understanding it is not the same as being helpless against it. Where I grew up, there were rivers with animals just like this one. Children were taught from a very young age how to read the water, how to recognize a drag mark on the mud bank, how to know when a crossing was safe and when it was not. People did not avoid the rivers. They learned to live beside them. A cadet near the front, a villain named Tarek Austin, raised a hand and asked the obvious question before I could. Why would anyone choose to live beside something that dangerous, instead of simply relocating somewhere safer? Elena turned to face him, and her answer was not defensive or boastful. It was simple, delivered the way someone explains something they consider basic knowledge rather than a remarkable feat. Because almost everywhere on our planet has something dangerous nearby, she said. If you wait for a place with no danger at all, you will spend your whole life waiting. So instead, people learn the danger well enough that it stops being random and starts being predictable. Predictable danger is something you can plan around. It is the danger you do not understand that actually kills you. I remember standing there watching my own students absorb that answer with expressions I had never seen during this unit before. Not fear, not shock. Something closer to genuine curiosity, the kind that makes a student lean forward instead of away. I decided to push further, partly for the benefit of the class, and partly because I needed to understand this myself. I asked her to walk us through what she considered the actual dangerous parts of her homeworld, the ones that went beyond a single predator in a river. She was quiet for a moment, and then she began speaking in a way that completely reshaped my understanding of everything I thought I knew about her species. She told us about small flying insects capable of carrying diseases that could end a life within days, and how her people had developed medicines, protective clothing, and community practices specifically designed around avoiding and treating those diseases, refined over countless generations until the danger became manageable rather than catastrophic. She told us about storms so powerful they could destroy entire coastal settlements, and how human engineers had studied wind patterns and ocean currents for centuries until they could predict these storms days in advance, giving entire populations time to prepare or relocate before disaster struck. She told us about venomous creatures small enough to hide in clothing or bedding, and how instead of eradicating them entirely, many human cultures studied their venom until it became the basis for medicines that saved far more lives than the creatures themselves ever threatened. Every example she gave followed the same pattern. A threat existed. Instead of retreating from it entirely, her species studied it, adapted to it, and eventually turned understanding into a form of quiet mastery, not through overwhelming strength, and not through eliminating every danger from their environment, but through patience, observation, and an apparently endless willingness to learn from every mistake along the way. I asked her one more question before the session ended, one that had been building in my mind since the moment she first tilted her head at that bear projection with something closer to curiosity than fear. If your world contains this many threats, I asked, why have your people not simply avoided settling in the most dangerous regions altogether? She smiled slightly, and it was not a mocking expression, but something closer to fondness, as if she were remembering a place she genuinely cared about. Because the most dangerous places are often the most beautiful ones, she said. Thick forests, wide rivers, coastlines full of life. People do not want to give those places up just because something dangerous also lives there. So instead, they learn to share the space. It took a long time, and it cost my ancestors a great deal along the way, but eventually, most communities found a balance that let them live well without constant conflict against the land itself. That evening, I sat in my office long after the other instructors had left for the day, staring at the restricted archive files still glowing faintly on my desk display. I began cross-referencing every Predator profile in my Deathworld unit against the small amount of additional context Elena had provided, and a pattern started to emerge that unsettled me deeply. My entire curriculum had been built using survey data collected by outside observers, most of it gathered from a distance using remote sensors, brief expedition reports, and second-hand accounts from diplomatic visits that rarely lasted more than a few weeks. None of it had been built using first-hand accounts from people who had actually lived among these dangers their entire lives. I had been teaching an outsider's version of fear, built entirely from the perspective of beings who visited Earth briefly and left as quickly as possible, rather than the lived experience of beings who called it home. The following day, I made a decision that surprised even me. I requested a private meeting with Elena after class, and when she arrived at my office, I did something I had not done in 11 cycles of teaching. I asked a cadet to help me redesign part of my own course. I told her honestly that everything I had taught up until that point had been built on incomplete information, and that I wanted to understand what a true Deathworld education looked like from someone who had actually survived one, rather than someone who had only studied it from a safe distance. She considered my request carefully before answering, and when she finally spoke, her tone carried a weight I had not heard from her before, something closer to responsibility than pride. "I can tell you what I know," she said, "but I want to be honest with you first. Even the things I am about to share will only be the beginning. There are parts of my world that even most humans never fully master, situations where the smartest choice is still simply to walk away and live to try again another day. If I show you everything, some of your students may leave more nervous than when they arrived, not less." I told her that was exactly what I needed, because a nervous student who understood the truth was infinitely more valuable to me than a confident student who did not. She nodded slowly, and for the first time since she had walked into my classroom 15 minutes late on that very first day, I saw something shift in her expression, a quiet decision being made behind her calm exterior. "Then let me build the next lesson myself," she said. "I think it is time your class learned what a death world actually teaches the people who grow up inside it." I agreed without hesitation, even though some part of me already suspected that agreeing to that request was going to change far more than just my curriculum. It was going to change the way I saw an entire species that I had spent 11 cycles teaching my students to fear rather than understand. Word spread quickly through the academy that the fear class was going to have a cadet lead a lecture, and by the time the next session began, the training dome was filled beyond its usual capacity. Instructors from other departments had quietly slipped in along the back wall, and even the academy director, a tall silver-skinned Korvath named Administrator Belric Onus, had chosen to observe from a side entrance without announcing his presence until the session was already underway. Elena stood at the front of the room, and for the first time since I had met her, she looked genuinely aware of the weight of the moment, though she did not let it shake her composure. She began not with a predator, but with a simple question directed at the entire class. "What do you think keeps a species alive on a dangerous world?" she asked. "Strength, weapons, speed." A few cadets offered answers, and each time she shook her head gently, not dismissing them, but redirecting their thinking. "None of those things matter if you do not survive long enough to use them," she said. "What actually keeps a species alive is the ability to learn faster than the environment can kill you. That is the entire foundation of everything I am about to show you." She activated the projection system herself, something I had never allowed a cadet to do before, and the first image that appeared was not a predator at all. It was a simple diagram of a human settlement built along the edge of a wide river, houses raised on stilts, walkways elevated above the water, warning markers placed along specific points of the riverbank. "This is not a fortress," she explained. "It is a village. People have lived here for generations, right beside animals capable of ending a life in seconds. They did not build walls to keep the danger out. They built knowledge instead, passed down from parents to children, about which parts of the water were safe, which times of day carried more risk, and which warning signs meant it was time to move quickly and quietly away." She then showed a second image, this time of children playing near the same riverbank, under the supervision of adults, who stood at specific distances, watching the water with quiet attentiveness rather than open alarm. "Fear taught these children to respect the river," she said. "It did not teach them to abandon it. There is a difference between running from something and understanding it well enough to live beside it without losing yourself to panic every single day." I watched my students lean forward as she spoke, completely absorbed in a way I had rarely witnessed during my own lectures. She had a way of presenting danger not as something to be conquered through force, but as something to be studied with patience, almost the way a scientist studies a difficult but fascinating problem. She moved through several more examples, each one following the same careful pattern. She described farmers who worked fields where venomous creatures were common, explaining how they wore specific types of footwear, checked storage areas before reaching inside, and taught their children simple rhymes to help identify dangerous species at a glance. She described coastal communities that studied tides and storm patterns so precisely that they could predict dangerous weather days before it arrived, giving families time to secure their homes or relocate temporarily to safer ground. Then she reached a section of her lecture that made the entire room go completely silent. She projected an image of a dense forest, thick with vegetation, shadows pooling between ancient trees, and explained that this particular region was considered one of the most dangerous environments on her entire homeworld, home to predators, diseases, and terrain hazards that had claimed lives even among experienced travelers. "Some places," she said, "are still not fully understood, even by us. My people have studied this forest for generations, and there is still a great deal we do not know. The difference between us and a species that has not learned to survive a death world is not that we have eliminated every danger. It is that we know exactly which dangers we understand well enough to face, and which ones still deserve nothing but our respect and our distance." A cadet near the middle of the room, a small furred thrall named Ivy Calloway, raised her hand and asked a question that seemed to be on everyone's mind. "Has anyone from your world actually entered that forest and returned safely?" Elena nodded slowly. "Some have," she said. "Guides who spend their entire lives learning its patterns, who move through it with extreme caution and constant awareness. Even they will tell you that confidence in that place is the fastest way to lose your life. Respect is what keeps them breathing, not bravery. I found myself taking notes during her lecture, something I had not done in years, because the framework she was describing was fundamentally different from anything I had taught in my course. My lessons had always presented danger as something to catalog and avoid entirely. Hers presented danger as something to study, respect, and in some cases, carefully coexist alongside, while still acknowledging clear limits that even the most experienced humans chose not to cross. She continued for nearly 2 hours, far longer than any lecture I had ever given on this subject, and not a single cadet left early. She explained how human medicine had been shaped directly by dangerous wildlife, how venom research had led to treatments for numerous illnesses, how the study of extreme weather patterns had improved construction techniques used in settlements far beyond her homeworld's original borders. She explained how emergency response systems had been developed and refined over centuries, specifically because her species accepted that living on a Deathworld meant disaster would eventually happen, and the smartest response was not to pretend it would not, but to prepare thoroughly for when it did. Near the end of her presentation, Administrator Onus stepped forward from where he had been quietly observing, and the room fell silent again as he addressed her directly. "Cadet Marsh," he said, "everything you have described suggests a species that has spent its entire history in a state of careful negotiation with its environment rather than domination over it. Is that an accurate way to describe your people?" Elena considered the question seriously before answering. "I think that is exactly right," she said. "We are not the strongest species in any single category. We are not the fastest, and we are certainly not immune to the dangers around us. What we have instead is patience, and an ability to keep learning even after we lose people along the way. That is not something we are proud of because it makes us powerful. It is something we hold on to because it is the only reason we are still here at all." The administrator studied her for a long moment before turning to address me directly in front of the entire class. "Instructor Dross," he said, "I believe this academy has been teaching an incomplete curriculum for a very long time. I would like to see this corrected, starting immediately." I agreed without hesitation, and in that moment, standing in front of a room full of cadets who had just spent 2 hours listening more intently than I had ever seen them listen before, I understood that everything about my course was about to change in ways I could not yet fully predict. After the session ended, and the room slowly emptied, Elena remained behind, gathering a small data pad she had used to organize her notes. I approached her carefully, unsure exactly how to phrase what I wanted to ask. I told her that in 11 cycles of teaching, I had never once considered that fear itself might be an incomplete lesson, that perhaps the true skill worth teaching was not simply recognizing danger, but learning to live alongside it without losing composure or curiosity in the process. She looked at me for a long moment before answering, and her response carried a quiet honesty that stayed with me long after that day had ended. "Fear is not wrong," she said. "It kept my ancestors alive long enough to learn everything I just taught your class. But fear alone is only the beginning. If you stop there, you never get to the part where you actually learn to live. That is the part most outsiders never get to see, because by the time they visit our world, they are usually too afraid to stay long enough to understand it properly." I asked her, almost hesitantly, whether she believed any of my current students could learn to develop that same kind of understanding, given enough time and proper guidance. She smiled, and for the first time, it reached her eyes fully. "I think that is exactly what we should test next," she said. "Not with lectures, with something real." I did not know it yet, but that single sentence was about to lead directly into the most difficult and unforgettable lesson I had ever prepared in my entire teaching career. One that would finally show every remaining doubter in that academy exactly what it truly meant to come from a world that never stopped testing the people who called it home. The academy maintained a classified simulation chamber reserved for advanced tactical units, a facility I had only entered a handful of times during my entire career. Unlike the training dome where I normally taught, this chamber ran fully unmodified scenarios, meaning the projections responded with complete realism and no built-in restrictions designed to protect a participant from psychological or physical shock. Every cadet, who had previously attempted the chamber's highest difficulty scenario, a simulated encounter with an apex Deathworld predator running without any safety parameters at all, had required immediate extraction well before the exercise reached its natural conclusion. Even senior tactical instructors approached that particular simulation with visible caution. I requested special authorization to allow Elena to attempt it, and Administrator Onus approved the request personally, on the condition that he would observe the exercise himself alongside a small group of senior instructors and select cadets. On the day of the exercise, the observation gallery above the chamber was filled to capacity. I stood near the control panel with a technician named Pharaoh Belden, watching Elena prepare on the chamber floor below. She wore standard training gear, nothing unusual, and had specifically requested no weapons or protective equipment beyond what any ordinary civilian might carry during a wilderness encounter. I asked her one final time before the simulation began whether she wanted any adjustments made to the difficulty settings. "Run it exactly as designed," she said. "If I am going to prove anything today, it needs to be real." The chamber lights dimmed, and the simulation began. The projection formed slowly, resolving into a dense forest environment similar to the one she had described during her lecture days earlier. Thick fog curled between towering trees, and somewhere in the distance, a low guttural sound echoed through the simulated undergrowth. Every cadet in the observation gallery went completely still. Then the creature appeared. It emerged from the fog with terrible grace, a massive predator built for both speed and raw destructive force, easily 3 times the size of an average human, covered in dark ridged skin, its eyes locking directly onto Elena the moment it registered her presence. The simulation's biometric readout displayed the creature's simulated aggression levels rising rapidly, and I watched several instructors in the gallery visibly tense in response. Elena did not run. She did not reach for any weapon, because she had none. Instead, she slowed her movements deliberately, lowering herself slightly and turning her body at an angle rather than facing the creature directly. She kept her hands visible and loose at her sides, and she began speaking in a low, steady voice, not to the creature in any literal sense, but as a way of controlling her own breathing and maintaining calm. The creature took a step closer, and the entire gallery seemed to hold its breath along with the cadets on the observation platform. I want to explain what happened next as clearly as I can, because even now, having watched the recording multiple times since that day, it still strikes me as one of the most remarkable displays of controlled behavior I have ever witnessed. Elena continued backing away at an angle, never turning her back fully to the creature, never making sudden movements, and never allowing her breathing to spike in a way that might communicate distress. When the creature lunged forward in what the simulation registered as a testing motion rather than a full attack, she did not flinch or retreat suddenly. She simply held her position, lowered her gaze slightly to avoid appearing confrontational, and allowed the creature to close a portion of the distance before it stopped abruptly, seemingly confused by her lack of typical prey behavior. The technician beside me, Pharaoh Belden, whispered that her heart rate readout, monitored through her training gear, had barely risen above her resting baseline. For nearly 6 minutes, Elena maintained this careful distance, reading the creature's posture, adjusting her position in small increments, allowing the tension in the simulated environment to gradually decrease rather than escalate. At one point, the creature turned its head away entirely, distracted by a simulated environmental sound, and Elena used that brief window to create additional distance between herself and the predator without triggering another pursuit response. Eventually, the creature lost apparent interest entirely, turning and moving back into the fog from which it had emerged, its simulated aggression levels dropping steadily on the readout until they returned to a baseline consistent with a disinterested predator rather than an active threat. Elena remained still for a full minute after the creature disappeared before finally straightening and walking calmly toward the chamber exit. The simulation ended, and the chamber lights returned to their normal brightness. For several seconds, no one in the observation gallery spoke at all. Administrator Onus finally broke the silence, addressing the technician directly. "Confirm those biometric readings," he said. "I want to know if that display was accurate or if something malfunctioned during the exercise." Pharaoh Belden reviewed the data carefully before responding. "The readings are accurate, sir," she said. Cadet Marsh maintained a heart rate consistent with mild physical exertion throughout the entire encounter. There is no indication of significant stress response at any point during the simulation. I made my way down to the chamber floor as Elena exited, and I found myself asking the question that had been building in my mind since the very beginning of the exercise. "Were you not afraid at all?" I asked her. She considered the question honestly, taking a moment before answering, and her response was one I have thought about many times since that day. "I was aware," she said. "Awareness and fear are not always the same thing. Fear tells you something is dangerous. It does not tell you that the danger is automatically your enemy. That creature was not hunting me out of hatred. It was simply reacting to an unfamiliar presence in its territory. My job was to make myself as unthreatening and as understandable as possible, so that its instincts had a reason to stand down rather than escalate." A cadet standing nearby, one who had previously required extraction during his own attempt at a much easier version of this same exercise, asked her quietly how she had learned to stay so calm under that level of pressure. Elena turned to him, and her answer carried none of the pride I might have expected after such an extraordinary performance. Instead, it carried something closer to quiet humility. "We stopped trying to fight our planet a long time ago," she said. "It is bigger than us, and it always will be. What we learned instead was how to live inside it without losing ourselves to panic every single day. That is not bravery. It is simply practice, built up over many, many generations of people who came before me and made the mistakes so that I would not have to make them again." Administrator Onus descended from the observation gallery and approached us directly, his expression carrying a weight I had not seen from him before during my entire career at the Academy. "Instructor Dross," he said, "I believe we have significantly underestimated an entire category of species within our curriculum, and I do not believe this is a mistake unique to your course alone. I want a full review conducted, starting with everything Cadet Marsh has shared with your class so far." I agreed immediately, though my mind was already racing ahead to what that review would actually require. 11 cycles of established teaching material, built on second-hand data and outdated assumptions, was about to be dismantled and rebuilt from the ground up, and I found myself feeling something I had not expected to feel at the start of that day. I felt genuine excitement, the kind I had not experienced in my teaching career for a very long time. As the observation gallery slowly emptied and cadets filed out still discussing what they had just witnessed, Elena remained behind once more, watching the now empty chamber floor where the simulation had taken place only minutes earlier. I asked her one final question before we both left for the day, one that had been sitting quietly in the back of my mind since the very first moment she had walked into my classroom late on that very first morning. "Do you think your species will ever stop being afraid of Deathworlds entirely?" I asked. "Or is that fear simply a permanent part of who you are?" She looked at me for a long moment, and her answer, delivered quietly as we walked out of the chamber together, was the one that finally convinced me to rebuild my entire course from the very beginning. "I hope we never stop being a little afraid," she said. "The moment we do, we stop paying attention, and paying attention is the only reason any of us are still here to have this conversation at all." The weeks that followed the chamber exercise were unlike anything I had experienced in 11 cycles of teaching. Administrator Onas assembled a small committee tasked with reviewing every section of the Academy's threat ecology curriculum, and to my surprise, he asked me to lead it, alongside Elena, who had been granted special permission to assist despite still holding the rank of cadet. We began by going through my old lesson files one by one, and with each file, Elena offered corrections that reshaped not just the facts, but the entire perspective behind them. Predators I had once described purely as threats to be avoided she reframed as creatures with predictable patterns that could be studied, respected, and in many cases safely observed from an informed distance. Environmental hazards I had once presented as reasons to abandon an entire region, she reframed as challenges that generations of careful adaptation had gradually turned into manageable, even livable conditions. It was not a simple process. Some of the older material had to be removed entirely, replaced with case studies drawn directly from her own experiences and from historical records she helped me properly interpret for the first time. Other sections only needed small adjustments, a shift in tone here, an added explanation there, transforming lessons that once ended in warnings into lessons that ended in genuine understanding. During one of our long working sessions late in the evening, I asked her something that had been sitting with me since the day of the chamber exercise. Why did your people never simply share this knowledge with the wider galactic community sooner? I asked. If understanding a Deathworld properly makes it survivable, why let so many outside observers continue believing it was simply hopeless? She thought about the question carefully before answering, and her response revealed something about her species that I had not fully appreciated until that moment. Most visitors who came to study us never stayed long enough to ask the right questions, she said. They saw danger, documented it quickly, and left as soon as they safely could. That is not a criticism, it is simply what caution looks like from the outside, but real understanding only comes from staying, watching, and making mistakes slowly over time. Very few outside groups were ever willing to do that, and we never demanded that they should. We simply kept living the way we always had, and we assumed the rest of the galaxy would eventually catch up if it wanted to. That conversation stayed with me as we continued rebuilding the course, section by section, over the following month. I began incorporating her teaching philosophy directly into my lectures, shifting the entire tone away from cataloging fear and towards something I began calling coexistence tactics, a framework built around observation, patience, and earned respect rather than avoidance alone. The response from cadets was immediate and noticeable. Where my old lectures had once produced anxious silence, the new material produced genuine engagement. Students began asking thoughtful questions about behavior patterns instead of simply memorizing danger classifications. Several cadets specifically requested additional sessions with Elena, eager to understand more about how her species had managed to turn an entire planet full of extreme conditions into something they could not only survive, but genuinely call home. Administrator Onas eventually approved a permanent addition to the curriculum, formally naming Elena as a guest lecturer for the Coexistence Tactics Unit, a decision that had never before been extended to an active cadet in the Academy's long history. She balanced this new responsibility alongside her regular coursework with the same quiet composure she had shown from the very first day I had met her, never treating the honor as anything more than an opportunity to help her fellow cadets understand something she considered simply practical knowledge rather than a remarkable personal achievement. On the day the new curriculum officially launched, I stood in front of an entirely new class of first-year cadets. The training dome filled once again with nervous young faces from a dozen different worlds. Elena sat quietly near the front row this time, present as a guest instructor rather than a student, watching as I prepared to deliver a lecture that bore almost no resemblance to the one I had given at the very beginning of this entire journey. I activated the projection system, and the same familiar image of Earth's dense, teeming biosphere appeared above the room, forests and rivers and coastlines full of both beauty and danger in equal measure. I remember standing there for a moment, thinking back to the very first sentence I used to open this unit every single cycle before that year, a sentence I had repeated so many times it had become almost automatic. Deathworlders do not conquer their nature. They simply have not been erased by it yet. I did not say that sentence this time. Instead, I looked out at the new cadets, all of them watching me with the same nervous anticipation I remembered from every first session I had ever taught, and I offered them something closer to the truth I had finally learned. Deathworlders do not conquer nature, I told them. They negotiate with it, every single day, generation after generation, until understanding replaces panic, and respect replaces avoidance. They make mistakes. They lose people along the way. And they keep learning anyway, because giving up was never actually an option available to them in the first place. I glanced toward Elena as I spoke, and she offered the smallest nod of acknowledgement, the kind of quiet approval that meant more to me than any formal recognition the Academy could have given. I continued the lecture, walking the new cadets through examples that would have seemed impossible to me only a few months earlier. Stories of settlements built beside dangerous rivers, of farmers who shared their fields with venomous creatures, of communities that studied storms so thoroughly they could predict disaster days in advance and prepare accordingly rather than simply fleeing blindly when danger finally arrived. I told them about medicines developed from creatures once considered purely lethal. I told them about children taught from a young age not to fear their environment blindly, but to read it carefully, to recognize its patterns, and to understand exactly which risks were worth taking and which ones still deserved nothing but careful distance and respect. By the end of that first session, the new cadets were leaning forward in their seats, asking questions with genuine curiosity, rather than sitting frozen in quiet dread the way earlier classes always had. It was, without question, the best opening lecture I had delivered in my entire career, and I owed almost every part of it to a single transfer cadet who had walked into my classroom 15 minutes late on an otherwise ordinary morning. After the session ended and the new cadets filed out, discussing what they had just learned with an energy I had never witnessed in this course before, Elena remained behind once more, gathering her things slowly. I approached her and thanked her properly for the first time, not just for correcting my curriculum, but for changing the entire way I understood an idea I had taught with confidence for 11 cycles without ever fully questioning it. She smiled, and there was something warm in it, something that suggested she had known all along how this would eventually unfold, even from that very first day when she had calmly identified a projected bear as simply curious rather than dangerous. "You spent 11 cycles teaching cadets to fear Deathworlds," she said. "I only had to spend a few weeks teaching you what it actually means to survive one." I asked her, half joking but genuinely curious, whether she believed any other species could ever fully develop that same kind of quiet mastery over their environment, given enough time and enough willingness to learn. She considered the question seriously, the way she considered every question I had ever asked her, and her final answer was one I have carried with me ever since, long after she eventually graduated from the academy and moved on to serve among the stars herself. "Any species can learn it," she said, "as long as they are willing to keep trying after they fail. That is the only real secret behind everything I have shown you. It was never about being unafraid. It was always about refusing to stop learning, no matter how many times the world reminded us exactly how dangerous it could be." I never forgot those words, and years later, long after Elena had left the academy to pursue her own path among the stars, I still opened every new class with the same lesson she had taught me on that very first day, back when I had believed, wrongly, that fear alone was the entire lesson worth teaching. Deathworlders do not conquer nature. They learn to live inside its jaws, and somewhere along the way, against every reasonable expectation, they learn to call it home.